Thanks, Anna. Okay, thank you, Anna. So yeah, as Anna said, I'm a YPAC member. I've been birding and doing bird photography since 2017. Really, I started birding long before that with my granddad back when I was a kid, but I picked it back up in 2017. My normal day job is a mechanical engineer in oil and gas. And if you have Instagram, you can follow me at the Texas Birder on Instagram. That's where I post all of my bird photos. So this is my first time teaching this course. So hopefully you learned something from me. But if not, hopefully you at least get some terms and some ideas about things to Google on your own and learn more about on your own. So let's go ahead and jump right in here. Whoops. Use the arrow keys. Okay. All right. So our agenda is going to be, first, we're going to start with birding and photography ethics. I think this is a good place to start. A lot of presentations on bird photography leave this on at the end, kind of almost as an afterthought, but I think it's a very important topic to discuss. We'll look at the gear that you're going to need, camera modes and settings. We'll go over some composition ideas, post-processing, and then some tips and tricks. And then I've got some local birding hotspots listed in the presentation as well. And I'm sure we'll be able to share these meeting slides with you after the meeting is over. So don't worry about that. You'll get a copy of these. All right, so birding and photography ethics. A great resource is the National Audubon's website. They have a webpage and a guide to ethical bird photography and videography. But the basics really come down to, you want to keep the birds safe, right? I mean, that's why we're all trying to do this, to conserve birds, bird habitat. So avoid putting unnecessary stress on the birds. Use a telephoto lens so you can get that shot you want without having to get too close to the birds. Use bird blinds if they're available. They're not always available. So, if you can't use one, you can't, but just try to stay back from the bird. Don't try to flush birds out to get a photo. Could disrupt their natural behavior, put them at risk for injury or risk from predators. General rule of thumb is if you cause the bird to flush or fly away, you're probably too close to it. You need to back up a little bit. Pishing. I don't know if any of you, if you all know what pishing is, but that's generally okay. Basically, you make a pish noise with your own mouth, just to kind of get the bird interested in you. And a lot of little songbirds will kind of move down closer to the sound to figure out what's going on. So that's generally okay, but you're going to want to mostly avoid the use of playback, mating calls, things like that can be disruptive to birds. And you really don't want to use bait. Live bait, live animals, dead animals, meat, decoys, all of that kind of stuff is really a no-no for ethical bird photography. Obviously, backyard bird feeders are beneficial to birds, so fill your feeders up and take photos of them on there, and that's A-okay. Go for that. And then for birds that are rare or vulnerable, nesting birds, owls, you want to try to avoid sharing your location if you can. If you're on eBird, you should be able to hide that particular list or obscure your location if you are eBirding while you do photography. And otherwise, just avoid broadcasting that information out to other birders as much as possible. If you trust a birder and know that they're not going to do anything to harm the bird, there's really no harm in that. But if you read stories, there's bird photographers that will go where snowy owls are found, like in upstate New York and places like that, and they'll harass the birds all day long, and they're already tired from migration, and they're just worn out and just trying to survive. So you want to avoid doing things like that If you find a bird that's rare and is maybe has just made it back from migration or is just about to leave on migration, you want to keep them as stress-free as possible. Be respectful for your surroundings. That seems like a pretty obvious one, especially here in Texas. Don't trespass. Bird in public places. Get permission to bird on private land if you want to do that. There are places around the city where people might give you permission to bird on their land, but you always want to ask first. Highway right-of-ways, you can bird on those. Back road right-of-ways, that's fine, but obviously don't cross fence lines, anything like that. And even if there's not a fence line, it might still be private property when you get off the right-of-way. So just be cognizant of that. Don't trample or destroy vegetation. Stay on trails, follow the signage. Kind of common sense stuff, but you'd be surprised about what a lot of people will do to get that one perfect shot. And then always be considerate of other birders. If there's multiple people trying to take a photo of a single bird, don't jump in front of them to get the shot that you want. And, who cares what happens to them, right? So be considerate, and then be transparent in your photography. If you're taking photos of captive subjects, captive birds, you want to highlight that, label it as such, and obviously give credit where credit is due. If you're taking photo, if there's artwork or something in the background that's a main focal point of your image, give credit to the artist. Give credit to, if you've been taken out on a tour or something like that in an exotic location, give credit to that, to those tour providers, things like that. So I encourage you all to go to Audubon's website, like I said earlier, and review their guide to ethical bird photography and videography. It's a very important part of what we do as nature photographers, and you always want to have these things in the back of your mind. So that's why I started with it today. Okay, so let's jump into a little more of the details of actually birding 101. So we'll start with the gear. For those interested, my camera setup, I currently have a Canon 90D and a Tamron 150 to 600 millimeter telephoto zoom lens. This is kind of, I didn't necessarily plan this when I started. So this is, there's some things that I maybe would do differently in the future. Some things I have my eyes on, but really anything is going to work. That's the great thing about photography is almost any camera lens setup you have, you can make it work for yourself. So any brand model is going to work. Megapixel size. This is going to limit your cropping and your print size. You can find there's resources online that'll tell you if you have a certain megapixel camera, how big you can blow it up, how big you can print it to hang on your wall if that's something you're interested in. Most modern cameras, if you buy a new one, even the low end from Canon or Nikon, Sony, the low end kit cameras, those are going to be more than enough for you to do whatever you would want to do with your photos. If you want to hang them and put them above your fireplace or on a wall somewhere, pretty much any new modern camera you buy is going to be more than adequate for that. What you really want to look for is something that has a high frames per second, FPS. Basically, you can hold down the shutter or click the shutter numerous times, and it's going to continue to take photos without any sort of lag and processing time in between. And that's really important, obviously, for bird photography. When birds are moving around quickly, you want to take multiple shots so that you kind of guarantee yourself that you get that one that's good out of maybe 10 that you take. So something with the high frames per second is going to be beneficial for you. Really good quality autofocus is something to look for. And then high ISO to noise ratio is important as well. So you want something that can give you high ISO. We'll talk about that in a little bit on another slide. High ISO, but with low noise, it's important as well. Another thing that's a lot of people ask about now is if you shoot DSLR or mirrorless. DSLR is kind of your more traditional camera. It's a digital single lens reflex. It's a more traditional choice, but it's going to be bigger and bulkier. My Canon 90D is a DSLR. You'll see a lot of photographers are going to be using DSLR just because it's been around for a very long time. And the high-end Canon and Nikons, those are all going to be DSLR. But mirrorless is becoming a lot more popular, mainly due to the fact that they're really compact. There's no lens that has to flip and open to get the shot when you click the shutter button. The sensor's just right there. When you click, the light's in, and it takes a photo. So very compact, very quiet. But one of the things a lot of them lack is a traditional viewfinder. So it's almost like taking a photo with your phone. You kind of have to hold it out in front of you, and there's a screen, which is not great for bird photography. Not really what you want. They do make electronic viewfinders that you can add on, and they give you more accurate real-time information. Some of the higher end mirrorless cameras already come with them as part of the camera. So if you are thinking about mirrorless, definitely encourage you to find something that has a viewfinder or something that you can add an electronic viewfinder onto. But at the end of the day, the choice is really up to you, what works best for you, what fits your budget, all that. There's a lot of options out there. I won't be able to get into all of them today, but if you stick with kind of the known name brands, Canon, Nikon, Sony, any of those are going to have great cameras for you. Lots of options. A lot of their websites will even have kind of a help me select feature where you just kind of choose some options and they'll kind of tell you, hey, this is the perfect camera for you. You might start that way. Really the main thing that you really want to focus on to get really good bird photos though is the lens. The lens is almost more important than the camera itself. There's multiple aftermarket brands. There's Sigma and Tamron. Those are going to be cheaper than the name brands like Canon and Nikon. Obviously every camera manufacturer, most camera manufacturers are going to make their own lenses that fit their own cameras. They're going to be a little bit more expensive. So the aftermarket is, I went the aftermarket route just because I couldn't afford a nice new Canon lens. But the aftermarket route is great. You'll see a lot of testimonials online about bird photographers using either the Sigma or the Tamron, and you get great results from it. Just make sure that it fits your camera, because not every camera manufacturer makes things the same way. So a Canon lens is not going to fit on a Nikon lens. It's not going to fit on a Sony camera. You gotta make sure it's compatible. The main things to look for are going to be focal length. The longer the better. We talked about that in the ethics portion. If you have a longer focal length, you can be further away from the birds and still get kind of that up close, tight shot that you want. You want something that's probably a focal length of 300 millimeters or longer. That's going to give you the best shots. 400 millimeter, 600 millimeter, those are great. My lens goes up to 600 millimeter. I generally shoot at 600 millimeter, but a 300 mil or a 400 mil camera or lens are going to be great. A lot of prime lenses, which are single focal lengths, you can't zoom in and out. A lot of prime lenses are going to be either at 400 or at 600. And you can get great shots with a 400 millimeter prime if you can afford it. They're expensive. Zoom lenses are good. Like I said, I've got a zoom lens. They're more affordable. They're versatile, but they're going to sacrifice on aperture, which we'll talk about, and weight as well. They're heavier than a prime lens in general. You want to find something that has the maximum aperture available for that focal length, which aperture, we'll talk about that. Smallest f-stop. It's the widest opening that the lens can go. And it's going to give you that good depth of field look, that bouquet where the background's blurred and your subject is, tack sharp. It's also going to help if you have a very low f-stop. Is going to give you more autofocus points within your camera. A lot of modern cameras have many autofocus points, but if you have an f8 camera or an f8 lens or an f5.6, not all of them are going to work. A lot of them require you to be able to open up that lens all the way to f4 or f2 even. So keep that in mind. If your camera has all these great focal points, but your lens doesn't support them, they're not going to work. So f4 is generally professional level, and like I said, we'll talk about aperture in a minute. But just keep that in mind if you're in the market for either a new camera body or a new lens. If you can get that f-stop to a lower number, you're going to open up a lot of possibilities for equipment and better photos. Okay, so now we're going to get into some of the camera settings. Some of the things I mentioned already: shutter speed, aperture, ISO. All of those make up what's called the exposure triangle, which is going to, depending on which of those settings you change, you're either going to get a brighter photo, a darker photo, a photo with more light, photo with more noise, less noise, photo with more sharpness, more depth of field. And you can kind of see that exposure triangle, how it works over here on the right. This is a pretty good resource when you're first learning to see, okay, if I change aperture, what's going to happen? Is it going to make it darker, lighter? Am I going to get more depth of field, less depth of field? So just studying this image here is a great way to kind of learn when you're starting out. And we'll talk about each of these a little bit more in depth as we go on. But for the camera settings, you can do a lot of things. You can go full manual, obviously, or you can go full automatic, where your camera decides what all of these settings are going to be for you, and you just have to point it and click the shutter button. That's kind of, your basic snapshot. That's kind of what you would do with your phone or an old point and shoot, something like that. You don't have many options, many creative options when you go with just program mode or full automatic. There's also shutter priority mode that's a little bit more advanced, and aperture priority mode. Both of these allow you to change one of the settings and the camera figures out the rest. So these are a great way to start and learn what your camera's doing. If you change one thing, what happens? Great way to learn. Shutter priority, you control the shutter speed. That's how long, when you hit the button, how long the lens stays open, how much light's getting into the sensor, and the camera controls the aperture. Aperture priority mode, obviously it's the opposite. You control the aperture, and the camera is going to control the shutter speed. This is probably your best way to start. I will say that sometimes, especially if you're shooting in dark situations, that camera is going to turn your shutter speed way down. So it's going to take a very long exposure, right? So you might be in your backyard, it's shady, you're trying to shoot a bird on a bird feeder, and you're in aperture priority mode, you get it set right, hit the shutter button, and it's going to take a quarter of a second to take that photo. So if you're moving, you might end up with a blurry photo. So you want to just kind of be aware of what your camera's doing when you're in these modes, so that you know, okay, this is going to take, a few seconds, a quarter of a second, half of a second, whatever, to actually take this photo instead of, 1/1000th of a second. And that's going to affect how your image quality, how it comes out. But this is probably the best one to start with, aperture priority mode. It's going to allow you to get that depth of field you want, blurry background, sharp, tack sharp subject. Everybody kind of wants that look in a bird photo. So this is the easiest way to get that if you're a beginner. Manual mode, obviously, it's a little bit more advanced. You'll probably, if you start with bird photography and stick with it and keep going, you'll find yourself where you're a lot more comfortable shooting in manual mode. I mostly shoot in manual mode. You control everything. I do it where the camera controls ISO, so I don't have to worry about ISO, but I control aperture and shutter speed and all of that. But you got a lot more control over the image if you do it that way. And I also find too that, you know, it may seem daunting at first to shoot in manual mode. You think you have to change your settings every single time you take a photo. A lot of times if you're out, the lighting's going to be relatively similar no matter where you are in a park or, you know, along the trail. At least, you know, for a few hours, the lighting's pretty similar, so you can kind of set it for your lighting situation that day and forget it. It's not as daunting as it seems. But like I said, I would recommend to you starting out, do some research on aperture priority mode, what it does, what it means, and start there, and learn the rest as you go. We're also going to talk about light metering modes and focusing in the next few slides. I've got an image here of kind of the click wheel on the camera for Canon and Nikon, which just kind of highlights the different modes that you can turn your wheel to and select. So that's how you're going to get between these modes: program, aperture, shutter priority, manual. You know, that you'll choose that with the dial on the camera. Okay, so the first thing we'll talk about in kind of that exposure triangle is the shutter speed. This is the amount of time that the shutter itself is open. And when the shutter is open, that's when light is getting to the sensor. Obviously, everything about photography, it all comes down to light, how you manipulate light and how the sensor sees the light and interprets it, and that's what creates the photo. So you're always thinking about lighting. How am I going to get enough light into the sensor to get the shot I want? And if I, you know, how do I do that, and what else does it change about the photo? We've got some kind of animations down here about how a shutter works. So slow shutter speed, you can see when it opens, it takes a little bit longer. Fast shutter speed goes real quick. You'll see on the camera, a lot of times I'm shooting at 1/1000th of a second, sometimes 1/2000th of a second. So you can imagine that's very, very quick. That shutter moves instantaneously almost. You probably wouldn't even be able to see it with the naked eye. So like I said, ranges from, you can have multiple seconds. If you're doing like photography of like the Milky Way or something, you might have multiple seconds where the shutter is open, down to 1/2000th or less of a second. Fast shutter speed, it's going to mean less light hits the sensor. That's going to require a lot of ambient light if you're trying to shoot in a dark situation, you know, deep in the understory, or early in the morning where there's not a lot of ambient light around you. You're going to have a hard time with a very fast shutter speed. So, you know, you kind of have to wait for that to shoot at 1/2000th or more or faster. You kind of have to wait till later in the day. But if you want to freeze the action, if you want to see a bird in flight and it's the entire wing and tail, head to tail, all the wingtips, everything is crisp and tack sharp, you have to shoot quickly with a fast shutter speed. Hummingbird photography, if you're trying to freeze their wings to where you can see all the detail in the wing, you have to have a very, very fast shutter speed, 1/2000th of a second or faster. Anything less is going to give you some blur in the wings. So you got to have great light for that, and you got to be fast. Slower shutter speeds, obviously more light's going to get to the sensor because the shutter's open for a longer period of time. This is great for, you know, shooting in low light situations, but the longer you have the shutter open and the more things are moving around in the environment, the blurrier they're going to be, because it's taking all this light that's coming in, and the light might be right here, you know, at one point in the camera at one point in time, but then the bird's going to move. It's going to shift around, so it's going to get blurry. But sometimes you might want that. This image here, I took at Bosque del Apache in the winter a couple of years ago in New Mexico, Sandhill Crane. This was maybe 6:30 in the morning. And as the birds were taking off, you know, I turned my shutter speed way down 1/30th of a second. So pretty slow relatively. And you can see I got some pretty cool motion blur in this image. And I think it turned out really neat, where the background's blurry. You can kind of see some motion in the wings. So sometimes you want that. The great thing about photography is it's up to you. There's no right formula, right? You can kind of play with shutter speed and get a blurry image, get a super sharp image. It's 100% up to you what you want to get out of the image that you're taking. So always room to experiment. That's the bottom line. You know, there's tips and tricks, how to get this photo or that photo. There's kind of formulaic things to it, but do your own thing and play around with it, and you'll get a lot more out of it if you put some thought and some artistic ability into it. Okay, moving on to aperture or f-stop. You'll see that term a lot. So the aperture, well, you may or may not be familiar with the definition of that word, but it's basically the space through which light passes in an optical or photographic instrument, a camera, especially the variable opening in a camera. Controls the amount of light hitting the sensor. So a larger aperture lets more light in, and a smaller aperture lets less light in. So that kind of sounds almost like shutter speed, right? So fast shutter speed, less light, slower shutter speed, more light. You can combine these two things as part of that exposure triangle to get different effects. So aperture is going to be independent of shutter speed. You can change it without affecting what shutter speed does. If you're in a full manual mode, if you're in an aperture priority mode or something like that, the camera is going to try to compensate and give you what it thinks is the right exposure. But that might not always be right for you. You might want something that looks a little different. So a higher aperture means more light, brighter image. And in terms of f-stop, it's actually going to be the smaller the number, the bigger the aperture. And that's because f-stops is a ratio of the focal length to diameter of aperture. I'm not going to get too much into this. It's pretty technical stuff, but you just want to know that you can kind of imagine it as it's written as a fraction. The f is the numerator and the number is the denominator. If you have a larger number in the denominator, it's actually a smaller number, right? So f2 is a bigger aperture than f8. And there's, you know, obviously there's a lot of charts and stuff on the internet that you can go and search and read more about this. But that's basically the takeaway, is that the larger the aperture, i.e. smaller the f-stop number, the more light is going to get into your camera. It's also going to control the depth of field of your photo. So a larger aperture, smaller f-stop number is going to give you a shallower depth of field. And what that means is that when you focus on something, there's a range of distance that it's actually focusing on. It's not focusing on a single plane. There's two planes, and in between those two planes, you're in focus. If you have a larger aperture, it means a shallower depth of field. It means those two focal planes come together, and the front of the bird might be at this one. His tail might be way back here. So if your aperture set to the depth of field looks like that, this tail way back here is going to be out of focus. So shallower depth of field means you have less in focus in front and behind your subject. A deeper depth of field means you're going to have a lot more in focus. There's a term bouquet in photography that generally refers to a very out of focus background, and that's achieved with a shallower depth of field. So to get that effect, you have to open up your aperture quite a bit, get that opening size really large. And that comes back to the point of lenses, quality lenses. A lot of lenses that are in my price range don't have super large apertures. They can only go to something like 5.6. That's as big as they get. Where professional lenses, they'll go down to f4 or even f2 or maybe even smaller. And you can see in this chart, the larger it gets, and these little mountains in the background, they're more in focus as your f number goes up, your aperture goes down. They're more in focus, but when you get up here to f4, f2, in that range, very blurry. So it's a desirable effect for a lot of people, especially in bird photography. If you're doing like nature photography in general or landscape photography, you're going to be shooting at a higher aperture, something like f11 or higher, because you want more of the scene in focus. But with bird photography, you want to get something with a bigger f number. F8 and smaller generally are good. And again, that means f8 for the aperture or bigger apertures, right? So those are good, generally good for bird photography. It kind of depends on the lens. Larger apertures better. I think my lens, when I have it fully zoomed out to 600 millimeter, it's only going to go down to f5.6. Like I said, professional photography, a lot of those guys are using f4 or smaller. So that's why lenses are kind of the most important part, because they dictate a lot of what the camera can actually see. F8 and higher used for landscape photography, like I said. So this is a pretty complicated concept, aperture, made kind of more complicated by the way that they write it as a fraction in the ratio of focal length to diameter. I encourage you, if you're interested, to go do a little bit more research on your own about this. There's a lot more to it than I could ever explain in an hour presentation. So, you know, I encourage you to go look into this a little bit more. But the big takeaways are: larger aperture is less light and shallower, larger aperture is more light and shallower depth of field. Smaller aperture is less light and deeper depth of field. Those are the two big takeaways from that. Okay, the third item in the exposure triangle is ISO. And what ISO is, if you ever did any photography with film, old film cameras, it was known as film speed. So ISO is just the International Organization for Standardization, and it's the light gathering ability of the film, or in this case, the digital sensor. Higher ISOs are great for low light situations, but it's going to come at a cost. You want to try to keep your ISO low, less than 800 or so, but increasing the ISO is going to give you more light in low light situations. It's also going to give you more noise or grain. Sometimes that's okay. Sometimes you want that textured look. You can also get rid of it in post-processing. There's a number of applications, computer programs that can get rid of that noise for you. But it comes at a cost, like I said. You want to keep it low. but sometimes you have to bump it up to get the light that you need to actually get the photo. When I shoot, I let my camera decide. I've told my camera, every camera is going to have an option to set the maximum ISO. And I've told mine, don't go above, I think it's set at 1600. I know that in my post-processing, I can get rid of that noise, even if it's all the way up at 1600. So I've told my camera, you can go to 1600 to make sure that I get the exposure that I need, but don't go any higher than that. You can see in some of these images, this one really, I found this on the internet, this is really good. At ISO 100, you can't see anything in the image. As you go up, you'll start to see more light coming in, more of the actual detail of the scene. But when you get up to ISO 6400, you know, this silhouetted succulent plant, I'm not sure what that would be, agave maybe, it should be all black, right? But it's not. It's got a lot of color noise and a lot of light noise in there to where it doesn't look so great anymore. So maybe something around ISO 800 is where you'd really want to shoot the scene, because you get that nice silhouette. But you still get a little bit of the detail with the light coming from maybe the moon, or maybe there's a city nearby, or just the stars themselves. So this is what ISO can do for you. It can give you lighting in a really low light situation, but it can also give you a lot of noise. I've got a photo that I actually took at ISO 4000. I'm not sure why I was shooting that high, but I was. And you can see there's a lot of noise, texture, graininess in the background. Maybe the eye and the bill aren't as sharp, but I could actually go back in post-processing and get rid of all of that. So it gave me enough light to get that shot, and then I could go clean it up after I was done when I got back to the house and on the computer. So don't be too afraid of going real high on your ISO if you're comfortable working in post-processing programs. You can kind of counteract the effect of going with a really high ISO. All right. So light metering modes. There's a lot of digital smarts in your modern digital camera. If you're shooting in one of the priority modes, aperture or shutter priority modes, you're going to be dealing with these metering modes. Nikon and Canon, they kind of label them differently. They've got their own proprietary different things they talk about. But the way to look at this is there's a few different metering modes. There's evaluative or matrix. That's going to use the whole frame to go in and make the decisions about, if you're in aperture priority mode, what the ISO should be, what the shutter speed should be. It's going to use the whole scene to do that. Partial or center weighted is going to use a small section of the frame. It's going to ignore kind of the outer edges, which generally aren't part of your subject. You don't care as much about them. Spot metering, it's going to use a single focal point. Generally the center point, you can move it around to meter the light and make those decisions on shutter speed, ISO, etc. I generally would shoot in spot metering mode. If you're in manual mode, it's not going to change anything, but it's going to give you the information on your camera screen to know what you're looking at. There's an exposure compensation, kind of a little chart here. This is on a Canon, so I'm a little bit more familiar with this. I think this is from a Nikon. This is how it would look. It's the same information. There's going to be a little tick mark here, and this is going to move around. And if it goes into the negative numbers, -1, 2, 3, you're underexposed. If it's in the positive numbers, you're potentially overexposed. Again, this is all your decision, right? The camera's telling you its best guess. At the end of the day, it's up to you to make the adjustments to get what you want out of your photo. So Generally, if you want a well-exposed, or what most people would consider a well-exposed image, you would want that little tick mark to be right at 0. That means you've got quote unquote perfect exposure. If you're shooting in manual mode, the way you're going to change that is you're going to change your aperture, your shutter speed, whatnot, to get it back to 0. If you're in one of the other modes, maybe you're in aperture priority, all you can change is the aperture mode, and you can't change it enough to get the effect that you want, the depth of field you want, while still keeping it well exposed. Well, in those modes, there is what's called aperture compensation, or exposure compensation, excuse me. And it's used to adjust the exposure if the metering didn't get it right, or you can't make the adjustments you need to get it right. You can go in, and it would generally be this button right here, would allow you to start to edit this, and then you just select with a click wheel, move that tick mark to the left or the right, depending on what you want. If you're underexposed, you move it over to the right, and the camera would know, okay, I need to overexpose this image beyond what I have the capability or what I think needs to happen right here. I need to make it a little bit brighter to get it to where it's exposed well. So you have that kind of trick up your sleeve where you don't have to go into full manual mode to get that perfect exposure. You can leave it in aperture priority, shutter priority, and still adjust. Tell the camera, hey, you need to get a little bit brighter because that last photo I took, I didn't like it. It wasn't dark, it wasn't light enough. It was too dark. I couldn't see the bird. You know, I was metered where I wanted to be, but still too dark. Let's bump it up a little bit. Let's get a little bit more light. And it'll adjust the settings for you and make sure that it gets you to that perfect exposure level. All right. So again, a lot of information with this. I encourage you, look at your camera's manual or go online and Google search light metering for DSLR or something like that, and you'll find tons and tons of resources, articles, different web pages that you can go to read about all this stuff. Autofocus, our next topic. You're going to want to use autofocus. It's very hard to manually focus on a bird, moving subject. Sometimes you kind of have to, but most of the time you're going to want to shoot in one of the autofocus modes. And you're really going to want to use what's called either AI servo or continuous servo, depending on what brand of camera you have. If it's a Canon, it's called AI servo. This is for moving subjects when you want to keep focusing distance from changing. You want to, or maybe the bird is moving in and out, it's moving away from you, closer to you, and you want to quickly focus. You don't have to turn the actual dial on the lens. This is going to allow you to keep that focus without making a lot of adjustments. You just hold down the autofocus button. The camera will continuously focus in and out to keep the subject where you've got your focal point in the viewfinder, to keep that part of the frame in focus. Continuously focused, like I said. And generally the exposure is going to be set at the moment the picture is taken. So if the bird moves closer to you or it moves further away, that might change the amount of light that would get to the sensor. So you don't want to have that exposure set right, 5 seconds before you take the photo. You want to take the photo and have the camera make the decision right then. So that's what's going to happen in AI servo or continuous servo mode. It'll keep focus on a moving subject, and it'll set the exposure right when you take the photo. There's going to be multiple areas that you can use to focus on, focus areas, they call them. And that's going to set different points or different areas of the frame in your viewfinder that the camera is going to use in AI servo mode to make a decision on what needs to be in focus. So single point or spot, this is great for small subjects. obviously birds, very small subjects at times. Single point, this is what it would look like in the Canon menu over here, and then the Nikon menu over here. Spot is actually going to be a smaller focal point than single point, which is kind of confusing. But single point generally uses one kind of pixel from the sensor, and spot, which not all cameras have, but some of the more higher end ones do, would actually use even just a fraction of that pixel to make a decision on what needs to be in focus. Humans, when we're looking at a photo, we're going to tend to look at the eye of the subject first. So that's a great place to start with taking a photo, is if you can set your single point or spot focal point on the eye of the bird. That's going to put enough of the bird in focus to give you, a good photo, an interesting photo where people are impressed with it. If you're focused down on the tail or something like that, and the head's out of focus, that's not as great as if that bird's face is in focus. So you're going to want to shoot typically in single point and put that focal point right on the bird's eye if you can. And a lot of times it's not always right at the center, right? The bird might be off to the side, depending on how you compose the photo. So you want to get used to how to move around your focal points. All cameras will allow you to do this with just a few button clicks. You can actually move that focal point. It'll kind of start normally right in the center. You can move it, a bunch of different places, depending on, bug flew right in my eye, depending on your camera type. Zones, it's going to be larger. Obviously, a zone is bigger than a single point. Used for bigger birds, birds in flight, moving birds, moving subjects. Different cameras are going to have different zones that you can choose from. Some of them are smaller, some of them are bigger. You can move them to different regions of the camera, all of that stuff. So depending on what kind of camera you have, this may be different from you or somebody else. So you'll want to get familiar with that with the camera that you have. Just know that that's going to open up more possibilities of focusing. If you have a zone that takes up the whole viewfinder, the camera is going to try to automatically pick what it thinks should be in focus. Your bird might be down on the bottom left, and the camera sees something at the top right, maybe a branch or a leaf or something, and it focuses on that instead of the bird. That's where you would want to use something like spot focus or single point focus. So you can tell the camera, hey, don't worry about this leaf up here. Let's focus on the bird. But in something like a landscape photo, maybe you want to have the biggest zone you can to get everything that you want in focus. Auto selection, that's where it's kind of the whole frame is opened up to focal, the camera's focusing. Good for landscapes, like I said, generally not great for birds because you're going to catch a leaf or something that's in front of the bird or behind the bird, and your bird subject's going to be out of focus. So use single point, AI servo, and try to focus on your subject's eye or somewhere on the face as much as possible. All right, so those are kind of the technical aspects of bird photography. Most of them all go back into this exposure triangle, aperture, ISO, shutter speed. This is all going to affect your depth of field, how much light you get on the subject, and how much noise is going to be produced when you take that photo. So all of these, try to learn these. It's best maybe to learn them individually at first, so you know what happens when you change one thing. And then once you kind of get a grasp of all three of those, you can apply this exposure triangle and really understand the dynamics between the different settings. So again, it's a lot of information, too much for me to cover here. So I encourage you to do some more research on each of these subjects as you get more involved in bird photography. The more knowledge you have, the better your shots are going to be. All right, so now we'll talk a little bit about, I think we're getting kind of close to time, so I'll hopefully get through these pretty quickly. Talk about more of the creative aspects of composition. So the big things to keep in mind are the rule of thirds. If you break down an image into thirds horizontally and vertically, you'll have 9 squares. You want to move your subjects around within those 9 squares. It doesn't always have to be right in the middle of the screen. Maybe sometimes you want to put it over to the left, top right, whatever it may be, to create that visual interest. Play with angles. You want to get eye level with the bird as much as possible. You don't want to be looking up at it where it's at the top of the tree, top of a 60-foot tree, and you're only looking at the bird's belly. Doesn't make for the greatest or most intriguing photo. So as much as possible, obviously you don't want to climb a 60-foot tree, but as much as possible, you want to get eye level with the bird. For water birds, shorebirds, ducks, things like that, get as low to the ground as possible. A lot of bird photographers will lay on the beach if they're shooting shorebirds. They'll climb into a lake and get their camera right at the water level. That's not possible for everybody. I don't do a lot of that just because that's too much effort for me. But if you want those really great shots, that's something to consider. You might have to do that. Lighting. We talked a lot about lighting. Light is the key to photography. So you always have to be thinking about where the light's coming from, how much light you have. Generally, you're going to want to keep the sun somewhere behind you so that it's shining on your subject and not from behind your subject. That'll give you the most well-lit shots. Sometimes you do want a silhouette shot. I've got one I'll show here in a minute. They make for really cool shots sometimes. So play around with where you are. You're always going to be, you've got the sun, you, and your subject. Play around with the order of those. Most of the time, you're going to want to be in between your subject and the sun. Sometimes you're going to want it to be the opposite, where the subject is between you and the sun. So play around with that. You'll get different types of shots. One of the really important things with bird photography, nature photography in general, is what's called catch lights. That's going to be that reflection in the eye, kind of that white glisten in the eye. It's just the reflection of the light source. So generally the reflection of the sun. And it's going to give your photos a lot more lifelike look. If you just have a black eye of a bird, that's not going to be as visually interesting. Most people aren't going to be as drawn to it as much as if there's that little glisten in there that gives it that little bit more lifelike appearance. Depth of field, shallow depth of field. We've talked about this. Shallow depth of field is for that bouquet or blurry effect. Larger depth of field for a more landscape look. Use your creativity. That's kind of the biggest thing I can say for bird photography or photography in general is what you want to see. You know what kind of photo you want to take. So, don't think you have to make your photo look exactly like mine or exactly like somebody else's on the internet. Take the photo you want to take. Portrait shots are good, but play around with it a little bit. Get more interesting shots, have action shots, small in frame where the bird is maybe just a very small fraction of your photo. Some obscured photos, I've got one of those I'll show you in a minute, but I think it's really cool. Just play around with it and, try to make your images tell a story. Just a straight portrait shot of a bird. Sometimes that's great, but sometimes it gets a little boring. It's going to get lost among, the other photos out there. So try to make your photo compelling. These are some of my photos where I've taken them and I've tried to kind of point out some of these composition points on them. I've got a couple of these slides just to show you. This is the rule of thirds. So you can see I've drawn these red lines in here to break up the image into thirds. A lot of times people want to put the subject right there in the middle. For instance, this bobcat, his head's right there in that middle square. But other times you want to shift the focus a little bit. You want to have more negative space in your image. So I moved this bird a little bit to the left. And there's that nice bouquet effect in the background with the blurred out background. I think that's a really nice image. You know, it's a little bit more visually compelling, a little more interesting than just a straight shot of that bird. This one's got a little bit larger depth of field. You can see a little bit more detail back there in the grasses, more bird, you know, just a little bit more detail there. We looked at this one earlier. This was a slow shutter speed for that blurry motion effect. Low angles. So this one's at the beach. If I had just been standing up, you know, 6 foot above this bird pointing down at it, this image would not be nearly as compelling as it is. This was right down, you know, crouched down onto the beach. We talked about this bobcat with the rule of thirds centered, but even still, you know, part of his backside is off to one side. The whole cat is not right there in the middle, which you might be, you know, compelled to do. But by moving it off to the side a little bit, you get a little bit more interest in it. Silhouette. So this was out in West Texas, far West Texas, on this Spanish dagger yucca plant, and this was I think a curve-billed thrasher. But that silhouette was really nice. If I tried to get this bird to where it was exposed, the sunrise would have been completely blown out and it would have just been white. So to get this effect, I focused, I exposed based on what the sky was telling me, not what the bird was telling me. This one's kind of that obscured look, the pileated woodpecker back behind the Spanish moss. You know, you don't always have to get the entire bird in focus to get a very compelling, interesting image. Storytelling, these are kind of both storytelling, eating the crawfish, and then this one might be a little bit hard to see with such a small image, but these killdeer are actually on their nest. So one of them was moving off and the other one was taking over nest duties. And if you were able to zoom in a little bit, you'd actually see the eggs down there. So try to capture shots like that. Obviously, this is one where you want to keep your distance because they're a nesting bird. You don't want to get too close to disturb them and run them off their nest. But if you can get shots like this, they're a lot more interesting than just a picture of a killdeer, right? Shallow depth of frame, small in frame even. So this has a lot of negative space in the image, but a lot of nice bouquet effect and a lot of colors that you get to play around with there. Sorry. Storytelling and creativity. Little green tree frog on the opposite side. I think this was a pickerel weed leaf. So, you know, you might be tempted to walk around the other side and get the frog where you can actually see the frog. But this is a nice way to tell that story without doing that. Get something a little bit different. The silhouette of the frog through the leaf is kind of neat. And then this is another one that's a shallow depth of field. The background, you can't really see any detail in the tree branches, the leaves, the pine needles. It's all blurred out. So this is what you would call a nice bouquet effect, shallow depth of field. Okay, moving on. We're already a little over time, but we'll touch on post-processing a little bit. I'm not going to get into this a lot because there's a lot of stuff here that you can do. But post-processing, if you're shooting in RAW, which you should be, it's going to need post-processing. You're going to want to shoot in RAW because it has all of that light and color information stored in the photo file. If you're shooting in JPEG, you're going to lose some of that. You have less ability to go back and make changes in post-processing. So you want to shoot in RAW, but most computer programs don't have the ability to see a photo in RAW. And even if they do, it's not going to look exactly like it looked in your viewfinder. So you have to go back in and make some edits. To do that, the number one program I've used a lot, I've tried some of the free ones, open source ones online. They work okay, but really you want to pay for Adobe Lightroom. If you're serious about it, even as an amateur, I think it's $10 a month. It's pretty affordable. Adobe Lightroom is the way to go. There's two apps. There's a phone app and a desktop app. I use both. And if you pay the $10, you get both. So you can kind of play around with that. Photoshop is really not necessary for most photographers. You can do everything you need to in Lightroom, manage your photos, basic edits, light, exposure, highlight, shadows, all of that, color, white balance, changing color mixing, saturation, details, increasing sharpness, details, noise reduction. You can do all of that in Lightroom. So you don't really need to worry about Photoshop. I never use Photoshop. I think it's intimidating, but Lightroom is fairly easy and straightforward to use. And then if you're shooting in RAW and you want to shoot with high ISO to get better exposed images, I would also recommend an add-on program called Topaz Denoise. It uses artificial intelligence, quote unquote, that's what they market it as anyway, to further reduce noise. It's a lot better noise reduction system than what comes standard in Lightroom. You can see here this yellow-billed cuckoo image. A lot of noise in this image when it started. Just a quick run through Topaz Denoise, it takes like 5 minutes. So like a one click of the button type thing. It's got to figure out where it needs to increase sharpness, where it needs to reduce noise. And it's great. I can't recommend it enough. And it's like a $40 one-time purchase. So very much worth it. Can almost make an unusable photo a really, really great photo. Need to remember to stop using my mouse because it goes quickly. Okay, so tips and tricks. It's kind of a wrap-up conclusion. Be ready, learn about your subjects. The more you know about the birds themselves, the better photos you're going to get, their behavior, habitat, what kind of food they eat. All of that can go into figuring out where a bird's going to be and what it's going to do when you do actually find it. You'll get a better photo knowing all of that stuff. Consider composition and light. As I've said a few times, light's the key to all photography. You have to remember that when you're doing photography. Try to get those catch lights in the eye. Get out early for the best light and more birds. Too early, you're not going to have enough light. But if you're there around sunrise, a little bit after sunrise, you're going to get nice golden light. Same thing for the evening. Golden hour light in the evening can make for great photos. Midday is possible. I actually do a lot because I go on lunch breaks at work, but it's not ideal. A lot of times the light's really harsh. If you're out in a national wildlife refuge or a national park or something, you can actually use your bird blind as a car. You would think a bird would be scared of your car driving up, but somehow they're less scared of that than you walking up to them. So if you're out on one of the auto trails, roll down your window and shoot straight out of your window, and the birds are less likely to be afraid of you. Be aware of your surroundings, be courteous, considerate, don't trespass. And then the keys are patience and practice. I take a lot of bird photos, and probably 10% of the photos I take when I click the shutter button are worth doing anything with at all. So you don't have to get that photo the first time you hit the shutter button every single time. A lot of them are going to be duds. Just stick with it, practice, play around with it, be patient, and you're going to get the shots you want eventually. All right. I won't go too much into this. These will be in the slides. These are some resources to learn about photography locally. And then I've got some links for online resources as well as some stuff about birding and nature education. Obviously, Houston Audubon is probably the best way to start with that. And Bird Week itself is a great way to get introduced into birding and conservation work. So I encourage you to attend as many of our Bird Week events as possible. I've also got a list of birding hotspots. I won't go into these, but there's a ton of birding in Houston, as you probably all already know. So just be aware that there's a lot of places, and I'll include this in the slides, a lot of resources online as well. Okay, so that wraps up my presentation. I know we went a little bit over time, but I think we've got some time before the next one for some questions. So
yes,
Anna,
awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Cameron. That was great. We do have a question in the chat, and if anybody else has questions, you're either welcome to like use the raise your hand button or just speak up. But first, Garth asked if you have any suggestions on types of trees to look for harder to find birds like warblers. There's an American mulberry that often has lots of birds. Are there any others?
That's a good question. I'm no tree expert. Anna, you could probably answer that question better than me.
Yeah, but, this is a really fun question, but good. Take a stab at it, and I can think of a couple.
So, I know that especially during migration season, a lot of the warblers are up high in trees, so you want a tree with a bigger canopy. I know I've got a couple of live oaks, really big live oaks in my backyard, and they love gleaning insects from underneath the bark on those. But they tend to stay up high during migration, so you got to look up.
Yeah, I'll say warblers and a lot of the insect eaters also really like oaks. So what some of our big oaks are really ideal for finding some of those really exciting species. We have a website, Houston Audubon has a website called Bird Friendly Houston that has native plant lists, and the more native plants, the more likely you'll see birds. So if you really are visiting areas that are restored or have ongoing restoration efforts, you're probably going to see more birds than in very like grassy kind of non-native habitats. So that's my suggestion. Okay, let's see. We have, does Houston Audubon offer photography field trips for amateur photographers? And we have an organization called the Houston Audubon Nature Photography. It's HAMPA Association. And so that information's on our website. They do field trips. Cameron, have you gone on any of, are you involved with HAMPA at all?
I have not done any of that, no.
Yeah.
But I think, are they doing anything for Bird Week? I wanted to say there was something for Bird Week, but
there's something, but yeah, feel free to email me or Cameron and we can get you that information.
Absolutely, yeah.
Gary,
I know that I've seen in the Owl Post, I've seen advertisements before for the photographers going down to like High Island and stuff like that. So there's definitely opportunities to get together with other photographers and hit up some of the great places that Houston Audubon has to offer.
Yeah, HAMPA pre-COVID did a whole photography workshop weekend at High Island one time. So there's definitely opportunities there. Cameron, are you going to be able to share your slides with the group? Because somebody asked how they can get a copy of all the birding spots. So we can, awesome. We will email those out. We'll email the slides out. Well, this is also available. We recorded it, so it'll be available to rewatch if you're interested, probably by the end of this week.
Yeah, the Houston Audubon has on their website, they have sites about all of their bird sanctuaries. That's a great place to start. Texas Parks and Wildlife as well. They have the Great Texas Coastal Birding Trail. If you go to their website, even just Google search Upper Texas Coast Birding Trail, it'll bring you to that website. And there's a lot of great resources there. They give you information about the park, whether it's day use or camping, if there's an entrance fee, all that kind of stuff is contained in the Texas Parks and Wildlife site.
All right, you got another question. For those of us still saving up for a camera and lens kit, is there any leeway for doing smartphone bird photography? Are there any smartphone telephoto lenses that are decent? And that's from Amna. And I hope I said that right.
I know that that exists, yes. I've never personally used any of the lens kits that you can attach to a smartphone, but I know they're out there. So it is an option for sure. And digiscoping is also something as well. Scopes are kind of expensive, but if you already have one, they make adapters to put your phone onto a scope and actually get photos from your scope, which a lot of times turn out really great. So that's an option as well.
That's what I use. Eileen asked, can I ask, what is YPAC? Cameron, I'll let you take this one.
Okay, so YPAC is the Young Professionals Advisory Council, I think, right? We're a group of obviously like-minded individuals around early professional age, so mid-20s, early 30s, that kind of thing. And our main focus is Bird Week, which is really to get more people in the community involved in Houston Audubon. So really, we want kind of that younger crowd, the next generation of birders and conservationists to become involved in Houston Audubon, and just get them thinking about what they can do to make the world a better place for birds and humans as well. So
I couldn't have said it better myself. I will say, the YPAC, we open up applications for YPAC if you know of anybody or if you yourself are interested in October every year for the following year. So YPAC applications will be open here soon for 2022. All right, so we've got some other comments. Featherfest is great. Yes, especially for bird photography trips. Thank you very much. This was awesome. Archbishop Fiorenza Park is a really great spot. And we do have a monthly urban bird survey at that park led by Marian Weber. So if you're interested in doing that, it's basically guided bird walk once a month. Let's see. Yep, some binoculars do have smartphone adapters. That's a super good point, Adrian. Yeah. Thank you. Are we going to receive a link to this presentation? Yes, we will send out Cameron's slides and the recording link probably at the end of this week. And then let's see. Lots of good suggestions in the chat and lots of compliments to you, Cameron. So thank you for putting on such a great presentation. Can you tell people, yeah, oh, you got it. Yeah, so if you are interested in following Cameron on Instagram, he's got his handle there. Can we share your email address too, Cameron, if they have questions?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
All right, I'm gonna put that in the chat. And then please, everybody, feel free to log in for more of our Bird Week events. The virtual ones to note are Avi Chat coming up on Wednesday and Bird Friendly Basics on Thursday. And if you feel like another hour of Zoom tonight, we have Birding 101 starting in 45 minutes. So there is still time to register for that.
Yeah, if you're new to birding, I definitely suggest that in addition to this class, because like I said, learning about the birds, how to find them, what their behaviors are like, that's going to get you much better photos than just going out there and pointing and shooting. So if you're new to birding, join up on that one in 45 minutes.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely night. Thank you.
Hope everybody learned something today. And if you have any questions, Anna shared my email, so don't hesitate to reach out and ask. I am available. Okay. Thank you.